The morning after the storm, two men walked out into the same frozen valley. Same land, same wind, same brutal night that had pushed temperatures down to minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit before midnight. One of them found his door frozen shut, his water barrel cracked, and his family huddled under every blanket they owned. Fire long dead, floor cold as iron. The other man stepped outside with his coat open. His cabin had held 54 degrees Fahrenheit through the night, without feeding the fire once after sundown. The neighbors who had watched him build that cabin 2 winters before didn't say much that morning. But they had said plenty back then, plenty about the strange, circular trench he had dug before laying a single log. About the weeks he spent hauling sandstone slabs nobody asked for. About the shape that made no sense to anyone who had ever built a square cabin on a square plot of frontier land. Wasted effort, one man had said. You're building a barn, not a house. What they didn't understand, what almost no one understood, was that the real cabin wasn't the walls they could see. It was what he had buried underneath. Something in that foundation changed how the cold moved, how the heat stayed, how a single fire, lit at dusk, could outlast a night that broke every other structure in the valley. This is the story of that cabin, that foundation, and a decision so quietly brilliant that it took one catastrophic winter to make everyone else finally pay attention. If you've ever wondered why old homesteads sometimes hold heat that modern houses never match, stick around. The answer was hiding in the ground the whole time. And if this is the kind of history that keeps you up at night, subscribe and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. We read every single one. His name was Caleb Morrow, and he had come to the valley with very little. A mule, a hand axe, 2 wool blankets, and a reputation for thinking longer than most men were willing to wait. He had spent his first winter in the region as a guest, if you could call it that, in a neighbor's overcrowded log cabin 6 miles north of the ridge. He slept near the fire, woke when the fire died, and spent those long dark hours listening to the wind find every gap between the logs. He was not afraid of cold, but he was by every account recorded in the oral history of that settlement, deeply offended by waste. And what he witnessed that winter was waste on a slow, daily scale. Firewood stacked head high before October, gone before February. Families burning through a cord of wood every 8 to 10 days just to keep a cabin at 38 degrees Fahrenheit by morning. Children sleeping in hats and gloves. Adults rationing heat like a currency they were always running short of. He said very little about any of it. He watched. He measured with his eyes. He asked questions that struck his host as peculiar, about how the floor felt at midnight compared to noon, about which wall was coldest to the touch, about whether the fire ever seemed to heat the room or only the space directly in front of it. By the time the snow began to melt in late March, Caleb Morrow had already decided 2 things. First, that he would build his own cabin before the next winter arrived. Second, that he would not build it the way everyone else had. He found his land in the upper bench of the valley, a slight rise, south-facing, sheltered on the northwest by a natural limestone shelf that cut the prevailing wind. Most settlers had avoided that bench. The ground was rocky, and rocky ground meant hard digging. But Caleb did not see rocky ground as an obstacle. He saw it as a material supply. He spent April and May doing something that baffled his closest neighbors, digging. Not a root cellar, not a well, a trench, circular, roughly 18 feet in interior diameter, cut down 30 inches into the frozen subsoil. He dug until he hit the frost line and then went 6 inches deeper. The excavated earth he piled outward in a ring, compacted by foot, forming a low berm around the perimeter. His neighbor Edmund Webb rode past on a Thursday afternoon in late April, pulled his horse up short, and stared for a long moment. "Caleb," he finally said, "what in God's name are you building?" Caleb didn't look up from the trench. "A floor," he said. Webb shook his head and rode on. The trench was only the beginning. Over the following 3 weeks, Caleb began filling it, not with timber, not with sod, but with stone. Flat slabs of limestone pulled from the natural shelf above, each one wedged dry against the next in a technique that local oral accounts describe as resembling the walling style used by Scottish and Irish settlers further north. No mortar, each stone relying on the weight and angle of its neighbors for stability. The wall rose from the base of the trench, 12 inches, then 18, then 24. By the time it reached grade level, it stood 30 inches above the original ground surface, a continuous circular ring of dry-stacked limestone, 2 feet thick at the base, tapering slightly to 18 inches at the top. From the outside, it looked like the foundation of a grain silo. Practical, impersonal, utterly without the conventional logic of frontier cabin construction, which demanded square corners, plumb walls, and timber from the ground up. What Caleb was building did not have a single right angle anywhere in its perimeter. The neighbors who saw it in its completed state before the logs went up mostly exchanged the same look. It was the look people give a thing that is clearly the product of great effort and equally great error. Webb, who had passed the site 3 more times since April, summed up the community's general feeling in a remark that local oral tradition preserved with some consistency. A man could lose a whole summer building the wrong shape. Caleb Morrow said nothing. He had timber to fell. By midsummer, the cabin had risen above its stone foundation, and the thing that had seemed merely eccentric now began to seem almost defiant. Frontier cabins of that era followed a grammar that everyone understood: rectangular footprint, saddle-notch corners, a single hearth centered on the gable end or positioned along the long wall. The shape was not tradition for tradition's sake. It was efficient use of straight timber. Logs are straight. Walls should be straight. Corners are where 2 walls meet, and corners are where you notch and lock. A circular plan broke every rule of that grammar simultaneously. To build round walls with straight logs, Caleb had cut his timber shorter than any of his neighbors, no log longer than 5 feet, and stacked them in a tight polygon that approximated a circle at the exterior while creating a nearly smooth interior surface when the gaps were chinked with a mixture of clay, dry grass, and animal hair. The result from a distance looked like a squat drum of logs. Unusual, slightly comic, very solid. The community's reaction moved through several recognizable phases. The first was curiosity. Men who passed the site on their way to the mill or the river crossing would slow their horses and look. A few stopped to ask questions. Caleb answered directly and briefly, never evangelizing, never explaining more than was asked. He had a habit of turning questions back. How much did you burn last February? That question, posed to Edmund Webb and 2 other neighbors in the same week, received the same uncomfortable silence each time. The second phase was skepticism delivered with humor. At the settlement's informal gathering point, a trading post 8 miles south, Caleb's round cabin became a reliable subject for jokes that mixed genuine puzzlement with social pressure. The round walls would gap in the cold, someone said. The roof would be impossible to seat correctly. A circular cabin had no proper wall for a bed frame. You couldn't place furniture right in a drum. The chimney would draw wrong. The third phase, quiet and less often recorded, was something closer to anxiety, because a few of the men watching Caleb work had begun to notice details they couldn't easily dismiss. The foundation walls were massive, not in an ostentatious way, but in the way that suggested serious thought had gone into them. Each stone was placed with care. There was no wobble, no lean, and the depth of the original trench, now partially visible where the berm had settled, meant that the stone base extended well below the frost line. Whatever that foundation was doing, it was doing it at a depth where the ground temperature held steady near 50 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, regardless of what happened on the surface. One man, a former millwright named Silas Cook, who had built structures in 3 different territories before settling in the valley, walked around the completed foundation twice without speaking. When Edmund Webb asked for his verdict, Cook said simply, "The stone's cold now. Ask me again in January." Webb didn't know what to make of that. Most of the others didn't either. But Caleb had heard it, and he nodded without turning around. The roof went up in August. A conical structure of split cedar shakes over a radial frame of bent saplings, seated directly on the top course of logs, and weighted at the crown with a flat capstone that sealed the smoke hole when the wind came from the north. It was not a conventional roof. It shed water in every direction simultaneously. It had no ridgeline to catch the prevailing wind and peel back in a gust. From the outside, the finished cabin looked like nothing anyone in that valley had built before. Low, round, dense, rooted in stone, with a chimney of dry-stacked fieldstone rising from the south quadrant and a single door facing east to catch the morning sun. Edmund Webb, riding past on the day Caleb finished chinking the last course of logs, stopped his horse one final time and looked at the structure for a long moment. "It's the ugliest thing I ever saw built on purpose," he said. Caleb set down his trowel. "Come back in February," he said. "To understand what Caleb Morrow built, you have to set aside the aesthetics and look at the physics. And the physics, it turns out, are not complicated. They're simply invisible to anyone who has never thought carefully about where heat actually goes. Every fireplace and wood stove built on the American frontier operated on the same basic principle. Combustion produces heat, heat rises, heat exits through the chimney. The fire warms the air in the room. The warm air rises. Cold air rushes in along the floor to replace it. The cycle continues, consuming wood and producing a column of warm air that is always trying to escape upward. This is called convective heating, and it is in thermal terms deeply wasteful because the moment the fire dies, the air cools within minutes. There is no stored heat in a plank floor. There is no stored heat in a timber wall. Wood is an insulator, not a storage medium. It resists the passage of heat, but it does not hold it. Stone is different. This is the first thing Caleb understood that most of his neighbors had not been forced to learn. Stone is a thermal mass material. That phrase, thermal mass, refers to a material's ability to absorb heat energy, hold it for a period of time, and then release it slowly as the surrounding temperature drops. Stone does this extraordinarily well. A 6-inch slab of dense limestone can absorb heat during the day, from fire, from sunlight, from the warmth of bodies in a room, and continue radiating that stored energy for 6 to 10 hours after the heat source is removed. Sandstone performs similarly. Granite, basalt, and fieldstone of sufficient density all share this property to varying degrees. The mathematics are not complicated. A pound of dry wood holds roughly 0.6 BTUs of heat per degree Fahrenheit of temperature change. A pound of limestone holds approximately 0.22 BTUs per degree, less per pound. But a stone wall weighs vastly more than a timber wall of equivalent volume. Caleb's circular foundation, at 2 feet thick, 30 inches tall, and approximately 56 feet in circumference, contains somewhere in the range of 18,000 to 22,000 pounds of limestone. At even a conservative absorption rate, that mass could store and re-radiate a significant fraction of a full evening's fire, silently, passively, without any additional fuel being added to the firebox. This is radiant heat, not convective, not dependent on air movement. Radiant heat transfers directly from a warm surface to a cooler one, from a stone wall to a human body sitting 6 feet away. The same way the sun warms your face through a window, even when the air outside is freezing. You feel it. It doesn't require the room to be uniformly warm. It doesn't escape when the door opens. It comes from the mass of the material itself, steadily, for hours. But Caleb had added a second layer to this principle, one that even Silas Cook hadn't fully recognized until he thought about it later. The foundation was below grade. That matters enormously. At a depth of 24 to 30 inches below the surface in that region, soil temperature remains relatively constant year-round, somewhere between 48 degrees Fahrenheit and 52 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of whether it is January or July above. This is called the thermal equilibrium zone of the Earth, the depth at which seasonal temperature swings no longer penetrate. By embedding his stone foundation into that zone, Caleb had connected the inside of his cabin to a slow, vast thermal reservoir. The ground itself, the earth below the frost line, does not freeze. It does not fluctuate, and the stone walls that reach down into it were in continuous contact with that stable temperature, drawing it upward into the room during the coldest nights and releasing daytime warmth back downward during the warmest days. The floor of Caleb's cabin, flat stones laid directly on compacted earth, was never truly cold. Even on mornings when the exterior temperature dropped to minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit, the stone floor inside held somewhere above 48 degrees Fahrenheit. Oral account from the first winter in that cabin describe it as feeling strangely warm underfoot, a sensation that struck visitors as almost uncanny because no fire was burning in the early mornings when they arrived. The fire did not heat the floor. The earth did, and the circular plan, which had seemed like an eccentricity, a provocation, a waste of perfectly good right angles, was not decorative. It was thermal geometry. A circle encloses the maximum possible area for a given perimeter length. That means a circular cabin of the same interior square footage as a rectangular one has less exterior wall surface exposed to the outside air. Less surface area equals less heat loss. Every square foot of exterior wall is a potential site of thermal leakage, a surface across which the warm inside and the cold outside are always negotiating. By minimizing that surface, Caleb had reduced the negotiation. There was one more thing: the corners. In a square or rectangular cabin, every 90-degree interior corner is a structural cold spot. Two exterior walls meet at a right angle, and the geometry of that junction means cold can approach from two directions simultaneously. The corner radiates heat outward faster than any flat wall section, and it receives radiant heat from the interior more poorly, because it faces inward at an angle that reduces its exposure to the fire. A cabin with four corners has four zones of accelerated heat loss built into its geometry by default. Caleb's cabin had none. The rounded interior wall received heat from the central fire in an unbroken ring. There was no shadow corner, no cold junction, no geometric dead zone. The fire's radiant energy reached every section of the stone perimeter at a roughly equivalent angle. The stone absorbed it equally, and when the fire died at midnight, the entire ring of stone released that stored heat back into the room, slowly, evenly, continuously, like a hand releasing a held warmth. It was not magic. It was not instinct. It was physics applied quietly and without apology by a man who had spent one winter watching other people freeze in well-built, perfectly square, thermally wasteful cabins. A foundation is not a thing most people think about. It is the part of a building that disappears, buried under the structure above it, invisible from the outside, unremarked upon once the walls go up. Most frontier builders treated it accordingly. You leveled the ground, set your cornerstones, laid your first course of timber, and moved on. The foundation was a beginning, not a feature. It was the part you finished so you could start the part that mattered. Caleb Morrow treated his foundation as the part that mattered most. He began in the second week of April, when the frost had retreated enough to make digging possible, but the ground was still firm, dense, and cooperative, not yet softened by spring rain into the loose mud that would have made precise excavation difficult. He marked the circle first, using a single stake at the center and a length of rope exactly 9 feet long, walking the perimeter and scoring the turf with a sharpened stick. The resulting circle was 18 feet in interior diameter. Not a large cabin by any measure, but a compact, defensible volume of space that a single fire could realistically warm. The excavation took 11 days. He dug the trench to a width of 26 inches, slightly wider than the finished wall would be, to allow for working room and the placement of a drainage layer at the base. The depth was 30 inches at the shallowest point, 36 inches at the north and northwest quadrants, where the prevailing winter wind would drive cold deepest into the soil and where he wanted the most thermal buffer between the exterior ground and the interior base. The soil he removed was not discarded. It was piled outward in a continuous berm, packed down by foot in 6-inch lifts, forming a low earthen ridge that would eventually integrate with the exterior base of the stone wall and add a third layer of insulation between the cabin interior and the open air at grade level. At the base of the trench, before a single stone was placed, he laid 2 inches of coarse gravel, small stones and creek rock, poured dry and raked level. This was not structural. It was hydraulic. Gravel does not retain water. Any moisture that migrated downward through the wall or condensed at the cold base of the trench would pass through the gravel layer and drain laterally away from the structure rather than pooling against the stone and encouraging frost heave. Frost heave, the expansion of water-saturated soil as it freezes, is one of the primary forces that destroys stone foundations over time. By keeping the base of the trench as dry as possible, Caleb was protecting his wall against the one force capable of dismantling it from beneath. The stone itself came from the limestone shelf 40 yards uphill, a natural outcropping that had been shedding flat-face slabs for as long as anyone could remember. Caleb selected his pieces methodically, rejecting any stone with visible fracture lines or hollow tones when struck with the back of the axe. He wanted density. A hollow stone holds less thermal mass and fails more easily under freeze-thaw cycling. The slabs he chose ranged from 3 to 7 inches in thickness and from roughly the size of a man's chest to pieces so large they required both hands and a slight lean to carry. He moved them one at a time, without a cart, rolling the largest ones on 2 short log sections used as improvised rollers, a technique that oral accounts suggest he had learned from watching a German mason work in the town where he had spent his 20s. The laying technique was dry stack with batter, meaning no mortar was used, and the wall was built with a slight inward lean, thicker at the base and narrower at the top. The batter was not dramatic, roughly 1 inch of inward slope for every 12 inches of height, but it served 2 purposes simultaneously. It made the wall structurally more stable, distributing the weight of each course downward and inward rather than simply stacking vertically. And it created a wall face on the interior side that angled slightly toward the room, a surface geometry that directed radiant heat inward rather than allowing it to reflect straight up toward the ceiling. Each stone was seated dry, shimmed with smaller fragments where needed to eliminate rocking, and oriented with its widest face horizontal. The joints between courses were staggered, never aligned vertically, the same principle used in brick masonry, where a continuous vertical joint creates a path of weakness through the entire wall. Caleb offset every joint by at least 4 inches, ensuring that any crack or settlement in one stone would not propagate to the course above or below. The interior face of the wall was packed with a mixture of clay-rich subsoil and dry grass, pushed firmly into every void between stones. This was not insulation in the conventional sense. It was thermal bridging, filling the air gaps that would otherwise allow cold to convect through the wall from outside to inside. Air is a poor thermal conductor when still, but an excellent one when moving. By eliminating the air pathways through the wall, Caleb turned what could have been a ventilated rubble pile into a dense, continuous thermal mass with very few pathways for convective heat loss. By the time the wall reached grade level, the original ground surface, it had consumed an estimated 4 tons of limestone. It rose another 24 inches above grade before Caleb set the final course, a row of particularly large, flat capstones, each one projecting slightly inward over the wall below, forming a ledge on which the first course of cabin logs would rest. That ledge was critical. It meant that no structural timber in the cabin made direct contact with the soil. Wood buried in or touching damp earth will rot within a decade in most climates. By elevating the entire log structure on a continuous stone ledge, Caleb extended the theoretical lifespan of the cabin's timber frame by several generations. The finished foundation stood 54 inches tall from the base of the gravel layer to the top of the capstone course, of which 30 inches were below grade and 24 inches were above it. From the outside, a person approaching the cabin would see approximately 2 feet of stone wall before the logs began. From the inside, the stone rose nearly to hip height before giving way to timber, creating a continuous interior surface of thermal mass that encircled the entire living space at the level where human bodies spent most of their time, seated, sleeping, working close to the floor. That was not accidental. Heat, in a room warmed by a central fire, stratifies. The warmest air rises to the ceiling, where it helps no one. The coldest air settles near the floor, where people actually live. A stone wall that radiates heat from hip height downward, from the most massive, heat-retentive material in the structure, counteracts that stratification directly. It does not heat the air above your head. It heats the space where your hands and feet and sleeping body actually are. Silas Cook, the former millwright, came to look at the completed foundation before the logs went up. He walked around it twice, ran his hand along the interior face, and pressed his palm flat against the stone at several points. He said nothing for a long time. "How much does it weigh?" he finally asked. Caleb thought about it for a moment. "Enough," he said. "There is a principle in geometry that most people learn in school and immediately forget, because it seems purely theoretical. Among all shapes with a given perimeter, the circle encloses the largest area. This is not a decorative fact. On the frontier, it was the difference between freezing and surviving. Consider two cabins built from the same total length of logs, with the same amount of timber, the same amount of labor, the same fire burning inside. One is rectangular, 16 feet by 12 feet, a standard frontier footprint. The other is circular, with a diameter that uses the same total perimeter length. The rectangular cabin encloses 192 square feet of interior space. The circular cabin, with identical perimeter length, encloses approximately 227 square feet, nearly 18% more usable floor area from the exact same material investment. But Caleb had not maximized his diameter. He had kept his cabin compact by choice, 18 feet across, which was smaller than a standard rectangular cabin of the era. His reasoning, as best as oral accounts reconstruct it, was deliberate. He was not trying to maximize floor space. He was trying to minimize the ratio of exterior wall surface to interior volume. That ratio, surface area to volume, is one of the most important numbers in thermal engineering, and it applies equally to a human body, a coffee cup, a storage barn, and a frontier cabin. The higher that ratio, the faster heat escapes. A large, thin structure loses heat rapidly because it has a great deal of surface area relative to the warm volume it contains. A small, compact, rounded structure loses heat slowly because every unit of interior volume is protected by relatively little exterior surface. A wolf knows this intuitively. It curls into a ball in the cold, compressing its surface-to-volume ratio, keeping its warm core insulated beneath the minimum possible skin exposure. A frontier cabin does not have that option, but a circular one comes closer to the optimal geometry than any rectangular alternative. Caleb's cabin, at 18 feet in interior diameter, had an interior floor area of approximately 254 square feet and an exterior wall perimeter of roughly 60 linear feet. A rectangular cabin of equivalent floor area, say 17 feet by 15 feet, would have a perimeter of 64 linear feet. That 4-foot difference sounds trivial. It is not. Across a wall height of 7 feet and an exterior surface temperature differential of 70 degrees Fahrenheit between inside and outside, those 4 extra linear feet of wall represent a meaningful increase in the rate of heat loss over a 12-hour night, an increase that must be compensated by additional firewood. Caleb was not the first person to understand this. Circular or near-circular structures appear independently across dozens of human cultures, and in virtually every case where they emerged in cold climates, thermal efficiency was either explicitly cited or can be inferred from the design choices. The Mongolian gur, often called a yurt in the West, is a circular felt structure engineered over centuries to heat rapidly and retain warmth in steppe winters that reach minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The Barabara built by Onangan communities in the Aleutian Islands combined circular or oval footprints with sod insulation and semi-subterranean positioning, achieving interior temperatures well above freezing even when exterior conditions were lethal. The stone roundhouses of the Scottish and Irish Bronze Age, some of which remained in use as shelters in the 19th century, used circular plans with central hearths and conical thatched roofs that created a convective chimney effect, drawing cold air up and out through the smoke hole while warm air pooled at floor level. Caleb likely knew something of the Scottish and Irish roundhouse tradition. Oral accounts suggest his family had emigrated from County Antrim in the north of Ireland 2 generations earlier, and the circular stone structures of that region were a living part of the architectural memory of those communities. He had not invented the round cabin. He had inherited a principle and applied it with the specific materials and conditions of the American frontier. The roof structure deserves particular attention because it addressed a problem that rectangular cabins handled poorly: wind load. A pitched gable roof, the standard frontier design, presents a large flat surface to the prevailing wind. In a severe storm, that surface catches the wind like a partial sail, generating lateral force that works against the notched corners of the log walls. Over years of storms, those corners loosen. The walls shift. Gaps open. The cabin that was tight in its first winter becomes drafty in its fifth. A conical roof has no flat surface. Wind strikes it at an angle and deflects upward and sideways, generating far less lateral force on the walls below. The structure does not catch the wind. It sheds it the way a sharpened bow sheds water. Caleb's cedar shea cone, weighted at its apex and seated directly on the final log course without overhanging eaves to catch gusts from below, was not an aesthetic choice. It was an aerodynamic one. Edmund Webb's barn lost 3 roof planks in the February storm of the cabin's first winter. Caleb's roof lost nothing. The door placement, facing east, was similarly deliberate. The prevailing winter wind in that valley came from the northwest. A door on the north or west face would open directly into that wind, driving cold air into the cabin every time it was used. An east-facing door opened away from the prevailing wind, into the morning sun, and into a slight natural windbreak created by the earthen berm that had been built up around the eastern quadrant of the foundation. Opening and closing the door in winter sent a brief pulse of cold air along the east wall, the wall that faced the rising sun and absorbed the most solar radiation during the short winter days, and that cold pulse dissipated before reaching the central hearth. None of these decisions were marked on a plan or drawn on paper. Caleb Morrow did not work for drawings. He worked from an understanding of how cold moved, how heat behaved, and how geometry could be used as quietly and precisely as any tool he owned. The cabin was not beautiful, but beauty was not what February required. October came early that year. By the second week of the month, the grass on the upper bench had gone straw-colored and brittle, and the aspens had shed their leaves in a single cold night that dropped to 28 degrees Fahrenheit before dawn. The settlement's older residents, those who had wintered in the valley more than twice, read the signs with the practiced unease of people who knew that early cold in October meant sustained cold in January. They began cutting wood with a particular urgency. Men who had planned to stop at 4 cords pushed to 5, then 6. Women banked extra earth against the north walls of their cabins. Children were pulled from tasks that could wait and given axes. Caleb Morrow cut 2.5 cords of wood and stopped. His neighbors noticed. Webb, who was splitting his 7th cord in early November, paused long enough to watch Caleb stack his second and final load under the lean-to he'd built against the east side of the cabin, and felt something between concern and irritation. "That's not enough," Webb said, across the fence line. Caleb drove a wedge into an upright round. "We'll see," he said. It was not bravado. It was a calculation, rough based on observation rather than formal measurement, but grounded in something real. Caleb had spent the summer months conducting what amounted to informal thermal experiments in the completed cabin. He had built small fires in the stone hearth and measured, with a thermometer he had carried west at considerable trouble, how the interior temperature behaved before, during, and after combustion. He had recorded his observations in a small leather notebook that local accounts indicate survived until at least the 1890s before its whereabouts became unknown. What he had found over the course of that first summer and fall confirmed what the physics of his foundation had promised. After a moderate fire burned for 3 hours in the evening, consuming roughly a quarter cord equivalent per week at that rate, the interior temperature of the cabin would reach 68 degrees Fahrenheit to 72 degrees Fahrenheit while the fire was active. When the fire was allowed to die at around 9 in the evening, the temperature did not drop immediately. It dropped slowly. Over the first 2 hours after extinction, it fell perhaps 4 to 6 degrees. Over the following 4 hours, the coldest part of the night, between midnight and 4 in the morning, it fell another 6 to 8 degrees. By dawn, with an exterior temperature of 35 degrees Fahrenheit to 40 degrees Fahrenheit in the fall conditions he was measuring The interior held between 54 degrees Fahrenheit and 58 degrees Fahrenheit. Without restarting the fire, in a conventional timber frame cabin of the same era, the same exterior conditions would typically produce an interior temperature at dawn of somewhere between 38 degrees Fahrenheit and 44 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold enough to see your breath, cold enough to make rising from bed a small act of will, cold enough that the first task of every morning was fire starting before anything else could happen. Caleb's cabin woke at 54 degrees Fahrenheit. You could dress without haste. You could set water to boil before the fire reached full strength. You could, in an emergency, go a full day on a single morning fire and still have a livable interior temperature by evening. That differential, roughly 14 degrees Fahrenheit to 18 degrees Fahrenheit on an ordinary cold fall morning, came almost entirely from the stone. The foundation walls had absorbed heat during the evening fire and were releasing it through the night in a slow, continuous radiation. The stone floor was doing the same. The interior of the cabin was not a box that happened to contain a fire. It was a thermal vessel, a structure that held heat the way a clay pot holds water, slowly and without drama, long after the source was removed. The first hard cold arrived in the third week of November, a sustained drop that pushed nighttime temperatures to 5 degrees Fahrenheit and held them there for 9 consecutive days. Webb's family burned through nearly a full cord in that stretch alone, firing their hearth almost continuously to maintain a survivable interior temperature. Several other families in the settlement reported similar consumption. One household, in a cabin with a gapped north wall and a shallow fieldstone foundation, burned through their emergency reserve and began dismantling a storage shed for fuel by the end of the week. Caleb burned approximately a third of a cord. His interior temperature at the coldest recorded point of that cold snap, a morning when the exterior thermometer read 5 degrees Fahrenheit, was 47 degrees Fahrenheit. Not warm, not comfortable in the way a modern heated home is comfortable, but survivable without extraordinary effort. His water did not freeze. His food stores did not harden. His family woke each morning to a cabin that required fire to be pleasant, but not fire to be safe. Webb came by on the 8th day of that cold snap, ostensibly to borrow a draw knife. He stayed longer than the errand required. He looked at the thermometer on Caleb's interior wall, 49 degrees Fahrenheit at mid-morning, fire just restarted, and looked at the stone wall beside it, and was quiet for a moment. "How's it doing that?" he asked finally. Caleb poured him a cup of coffee from the pot on the hearth. "The stone remembers the fire," he said, "even after the fire's gone." Webb turned the phrase over in his mind for a moment, then wrapped both hands around the cup and didn't say anything more. Outside, the wind was moving hard from the northwest. Inside, the stone held. January arrived without ceremony. There was no gradual descent into the cold that month. No gentle sequence of increasingly frigid mornings that gave the settlement time to adjust and prepare. January arrived as a wall. On the third day of the new year, the temperature dropped from 22 degrees Fahrenheit at noon to -8 degrees Fahrenheit by nightfall, and it kept falling through the night. By the time the settlement's few thermometers recorded their lowest readings, somewhere between 2 and 4 in the morning, the mercury had retreated to -22 degrees Fahrenheit. A wind had risen from the northwest shortly after dark, steady and unbroken, pressing against every north-facing wall in the valley with a force that those who experienced it would describe for the rest of their lives as something closer to a physical weight than a weather event. This was the night, not in the dramatic sense of a single catastrophic failure. No structures collapsed, no fires were lost in a way that cost lives. But it was the night that functioned as a full-scale, uncontrolled experiment on every thermal decision that every builder in that valley had made over the previous 2 years. The storm did not care about intentions. It tested results. Edmund Webb was awake by midnight. His fire, which had banked carefully before sleeping, had been overcome by the draft the wind was driving back down his chimney, a phenomenon common in conventional gable roof cabins when wind strikes the roof at the right angle and reverses the natural upward flow of hot air in the flue. The fire had not gone out entirely, but it had been reduced to coals and was producing almost no radiant heat. The interior of his cabin had fallen to 29 degrees Fahrenheit. He could see his breath in the firelight. His water bucket, set away from the hearth, had a skin of ice across its surface. He rebuilt the fire. It took 40 minutes to bring the room back to a tolerable temperature, consuming in that one emergency session what would normally have lasted a full day of moderate burning. When he finally returned to his bed at nearly 2 in the morning, the cabin was 44 degrees Fahrenheit, survivable, but not without cost. 3 other families in the settlement reported similar or worse experiences that night. One family, in a cabin with a gapped north wall that had been on the list of winter repairs since October and never reached, spent the night in a single room with every blanket they owned piled on a single bed, burning wood at a rate that would exhaust their remaining supply within 6 days if the cold held. Another household, a young couple in their first frontier winter, did not have enough wood to sustain continuous fire through the night and made the calculated decision to sleep in shifts, one person tending the fire while the other slept, rotating every 2 hours until dawn. At Caleb Morrow's cabin, the fire had been allowed to die at its customary time, shortly after 9 in the evening, once the stone had absorbed a full evening's heat. At midnight, while Webb was rebuilding his fire, Caleb's interior temperature was 51 degrees Fahrenheit. At 2 in the morning, the coldest recorded point of the storm, it was 48 degrees Fahrenheit. At dawn, when the wind had not yet relented and the exterior temperature still sat at minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit, Caleb's cabin interior measured 44 degrees Fahrenheit. He restarted the fire at first light, and by the time he opened his door to check on the animals in the lean-to shed, the interior had already climbed back to 56 degrees Fahrenheit, a recovery rate that reflected how quickly the pre-warmed stone mass responded to a new fire source, compared to the slower warm-up of a cabin whose walls had spent the night conducting heat outward unchecked. The differential between Caleb's cabin and Webb's at their respective worst points that night was approximately 15 degrees Fahrenheit to 19 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on whose account of Webb's minimum interior temperature is accepted. But the more consequential number was not the temperature gap. It was the wood consumption. Webb had burned nearly 3/4 of a cord in a single catastrophic night of emergency heating. Caleb had burned nothing. The fire he restarted at dawn was the first wood he had consumed since 9 the previous evening. That morning, Webb came across the fence line without the pretext of an errand. He simply walked up to Caleb's door and knocked, which was not something people in that settlement did casually in January. Caleb opened the door. A wave of noticeably warmer air moved outward from the interior. Not dramatic, not the blazing heat of a roaring fire, but the steady ambient warmth of a room that had held its temperature through the night. Webb stepped inside without being invited. He stood for a moment, feeling the air. He looked at the thermometer on the wall, 57 degrees Fahrenheit, fire burning low and quiet. He looked at the stone foundation wall, which rose to hip height around the entire room, its surface radiating a warmth that was perceptible even from a foot away. He put his hand flat against the stone. "It's warm," he said. He sounded genuinely surprised, as though the stone's warmth were a small violation of the natural order. "It's been warm all night," Caleb said. Webb kept his hand on the stone for a moment. Then he turned and looked at the room. The circular interior, the continuous ring of stone at hip height, the conical ceiling drawing the smoke cleanly upward, the east-facing door that had let in only a brief, deflected pulse of cold when it opened, already dissipated. "How much wood did you burn last night?" he asked. "None," Caleb said. "Not since 9. Webb said nothing for a long time. Then he sat down at Caleb's table without being asked, and Caleb poured him coffee without comment, and outside the wind was still moving hard from the northwest, and the temperature was still minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit, and the stone walls of the round cabin held their warmth with the quiet, unhurried confidence of something that had been built to do exactly this. There is a conversation that happens between a building and the ground beneath it. Most buildings ignore it. Caleb Morrow built his cabin specifically to listen. The conversation is about temperature, not the temperature of the air above, not the violent, variable surface temperature that swings from minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit in January to 95 degrees Fahrenheit in July, that changes hour by hour and day by day, that the frontier settler experiences as weather. The conversation is about the temperature below, the deep, stable, unhurried temperature of the Earth at depth, which barely knows that seasons exist. At the surface, soil temperature in a continental climate tracks air temperature closely. Freeze in winter, warm in summer. The ground at the very top mirrors the sky above it, with a slight lag. But that mirroring fades rapidly with depth. At 12 inches down, the seasonal swing is already noticeably smaller. At 24 inches, it is reduced further. By the time you reach 30 to 36 inches in most mid-latitude continental climates, the soil temperature has stabilized into something close to the mean annual air temperature for that region. Cool, but not frozen, warm, but not hot, essentially constant across all 4 seasons. In the valley where Caleb built, that stable depth temperature was estimated by later observers at somewhere between 48 degrees Fahrenheit and 52 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. Not warm enough to heat a room, but warm enough, critically warm enough, to prevent the floor of a building from becoming a cold surface through which the interior heat drained downward. This is a problem that almost no frontier cabin builder thought about, because it was invisible. The cold that settlers felt in their cabins came, they reasonably assumed, from the walls and the windows and the gaps and the chinking and the door that let in a blast of Arctic air every time it opened. That cold was real and obvious. But there was a second cold, slower, quieter, and equally relentless, rising from the floor itself. In a cabin built on a simple timber sill laid on shallow cornerstones, the floor was in thermal contact with soil that in January might be at 28 degrees Fahrenheit or colder the surface and barely above freezing at 8 inches down. That floor was not a floor. It was a cold radiator, a surface covering roughly 200 square feet of the cabin interior, constantly drawing heat downward and outward, impossible to warm fully with any fire burning above it. Caleb had severed that connection. His foundation extended 30 to 36 inches into the ground, down through the frost penetration zone, into the stable thermal layer where the soil held between 48 degrees Fahrenheit and 52 degrees Fahrenheit regardless of season. The stone walls were in direct physical contact with that stable zone, not with the frozen surface soil, not with the frost line, with the deep, steady, seasonally indifferent earth below it. That contact worked in 2 directions simultaneously. In the coldest winter months, the stable 48 degrees Fahrenheit to 52 degrees Fahrenheit earth below the foundation acted as a thermal floor, a reservoir of gentle warmth that prevented the stone walls from dropping below that threshold even when no fire was burning. The earth did not heat the cabin, but it held the stone's base temperature at a level that was 20 degrees Fahrenheit to 24 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the frozen surface ground outside, and that baseline was the foundation, in every sense, on which the fire's supplemental heat was layered each evening. In the hottest summer months, the same mechanism worked in reverse. The deep earth was cooler than the summer air above, and the stone walls, in contact with that cool mass, kept the interior of the cabin significantly lower in temperature than the outdoor air, a natural cooling effect that required no ice, no shade structures, and no additional effort. Oral accounts from the first summer Caleb spent in the completed cabin describe the interior as almost cold on bare feet at midday, even when the outdoor temperature exceeded 90 degrees Fahrenheit, an observation that puzzled visitors until the mechanism was understood. The stone floor inside the cabin, flat slabs of limestone laid directly on compacted earth, with no air gap between the stone and the ground, was the most direct expression of this thermal connection. Unlike a timber floor raised on joists above the ground, which creates a ventilated crawl space that can drop to near freezing temperatures in winter and conduct cold up through the boards, Caleb's stone floor was thermally continuous with the earth beneath it. It was, in the most literal sense, a piece of the ground that had been shaped into a floor, and it behaved accordingly, holding a temperature that the deep earth dictated rather than the air above. Visitors to the cabin in January consistently remarked on the floor, not because it was warm in the absolute sense, but because it was not cold. A timber floor in a frontier cabin in January could drop to 35 degrees Fahrenheit or below, cold enough to be painful to bare feet, cold enough that children and small animals instinctively avoided it, cold enough that the first 2 feet of air above it were significantly colder than the air at head height, creating a vertical temperature stratification that made the room feel far colder than any single thermometer reading could capture. Caleb's stone floor in January held between 48 degrees Fahrenheit and 51 degrees Fahrenheit. Not comfortable in a modern sense, but not painful, not stratifying, not silently and continuously draining the warmth from every person who stood on it. The effect on perceived comfort was disproportionate to the numbers. A room with a 65 degrees Fahrenheit air temperature and a 35 degrees Fahrenheit floor feels colder, in every practical sense, than a room with a 58 degrees Fahrenheit air temperature and a 50 degrees Fahrenheit floor. The body loses heat from its contact points, feet, seated surfaces, as readily as from the surrounding air, and cold surfaces in contact with warm bodies draw heat away through conduction far more efficiently than cold air does. Caleb's floor was not a luxury. It was a thermal engineering decision that made every degree his fire produced go further, because it prevented that heat from draining silently downward into frozen ground. Silas Cook, who visited the cabin twice during that first winter and made notes that reportedly survived in his family's papers, described the floor experience with the precision of a man who had spent his working life thinking about structures. The stone underfoot does not feel warm, but it does not steal from you the way a planked floor steals. You lose nothing to it. It asks nothing. It simply does not take. That was perhaps the most accurate summary of what Caleb had built. Not a cabin that added warmth through some novel technology. A cabin that stopped losing warmth through every surface that lesser buildings surrendered it through, one cold night at a time. To understand why the absence of corners mattered so profoundly in Caleb's cabin, it helps to stand inside a conventional frontier cabin on a night when the temperature has dropped to single digits and trace where the cold is coming from. It is not coming from the middle of the north wall. That wall is thick, it is chinked, and it presents a broad, flat surface that resists heat loss through shear mass. The logs in that wall, 2 to 4 feet from any corner, are doing their job reasonably well. The cold seeping through the flat expanse of a well-built log wall is slow and manageable, a steady, distributed loss that a moderate fire can overcome. The cold is coming from the corners. Stand in the northeast corner of a rectangular frontier cabin on that same January night and hold your bare hand near the junction where the 2 log walls meet. You will feel a temperature noticeably lower than anywhere else in the room. Not a draft, not a gap in the chinking, but a general chill that radiates from the corner geometry itself. This is not a defect in construction. It is a consequence of physics that no amount of careful joinery can eliminate. The corner problem operates through 3 compounding mechanisms. The first is geometric exposure. At every exterior corner of a rectangular building, 2 exterior wall surfaces converge. Cold air outside the building can approach that corner from 2 directions simultaneously, from the north and from the east, for example, in a northeast corner. The corner receives cold pressure from 2 faces at once, while any given flat wall section receives it from only one. The thermal load on a corner is structurally doubled before any other factor is considered. The second mechanism is reduced radiant heating from the interior fire. Radiant heat, the direct, line-of-sight transfer of thermal energy from a warm surface to a cooler one, obeys an inverse relationship with distance and angle. A flat wall section facing a central fire receives radiant heat at a relatively efficient angle. A corner, however, is set back from the fire's direct radiant path on both of its faces, and its inward angle means that each face partially shields the other from the fire's radiation. The corner is, in effect, in its own shadow, receiving less direct radiant heat than any flat wall section of equivalent size. The third mechanism is the most consequential for structural integrity over time: thermal cycling damage. Every time the cabin heats and cools, which in frontier conditions means every single day, the wood at the corner junction expands and contracts. 2 walls meeting at a right angle do not expand and contract in the same direction. They pull against each other, stressing the notch joints at the corner, gradually widening the gaps between log courses and creating the visible cracking and gapping at corners that is the first sign of aging in a log cabin. Those gaps do not have to be large to be thermally significant. A gap of a quarter-inch running the full height of a 7-foot wall section in a corner where cold approaches from two directions becomes a meaningful pathway for cold air infiltration, one that grows incrementally wider with each winter. For corners, for zones of doubled cold pressure, for zones of reduced radiant heating, for zones of accelerated structural weathering. In a 16 by 12-foot rectangular cabin, the corners occupy a small fraction of the total wall length but account, by some estimates, for a disproportionate share of total heat loss. Concentrated, compounding, and inevitable. Caleb's cabin had none of these junctions. The continuous curve of the circular wall presented no point at which cold could approach from two directions simultaneously. Every section of the exterior wall faced outward in a single direction, receiving cold pressure from one face only, exactly like the middle of a flat wall, and no worse. The interior fire radiated outward in a circular pattern that reached every section of the curved wall at a similar angle and distance, with no corner geometry to create shadow zones or reduce exposure. And the circular wall, with its continuous log courses notched only at the door frame, had no corner joints to weather and gap. The logs sat in their courses in a continuous ring, held by their own weight and by the stone foundation beneath them, with no structural weak points at angular junctions. The thermal consequence of this geometry was not subtle. In the January storm, when Silas Cook made his second visit to Caleb's cabin and spent time methodically touching the interior wall at multiple points around the room, he noted that the wall temperature was remarkably consistent, varying by no more than 2 or 3 degrees between any 2 points on the interior surface. There were no cold spots. There were no zones of concentrated chill. The ring of stone and timber maintained an even, continuous warmth around the entire perimeter of the room, delivering radiant heat with a uniformity that a rectangular cabin, with its 4 corner cold zones, could not approach. Cook's recorded observation from that visit, as preserved in a secondary account, was characteristically spare. The wall is the same everywhere. I have not seen that before. In a rectangular cabin, the same circuit of wall touching would have produced a clear pattern. Warm in the middle of the south wall, near the fire, cooler at the far corners, coldest at the northeast and northwest corners, where two exterior surfaces converged and where the fire's radiant reach was most attenuated by distance and angle. The occupants of that cabin learned, over a winter, to sleep away from those corners, to store their warmest belongings near the fire, to accept the cold zones as fixed features of their living space, permanent and unavoidable, the architectural price of the right angle. Caleb had simply refused to pay it. The decision to build round had looked, from the outside, like an aesthetic peculiarity at best and a structural mistake at worst. It had drawn jokes about barns and silos and the impracticality of placing furniture in a drum. But furniture placement was a comfort problem. Corners were a survival problem. And Caleb Morrow, who had spent one winter carefully measuring the places where other people's cabins failed, had decided, with characteristic quietness, to solve the survival problem first and leave the comfort problem for people with warmer options. The valley where Caleb Morrow built his round stone cabin was not, in the long view of human history, doing anything particularly new. That is not a diminishment. It is, if anything, a more remarkable fact that a man working alone on the American frontier, drawing on inherited memory and a winter's worth of careful observation, arrived at conclusions that dozens of separate human cultures had reached independently across thousands of years and thousands of miles. The convergence is not coincidental. It is the signature of a physical truth about cold climates and thermal geometry that asserts itself wherever people are cold enough and resourceful enough to pay close attention. The most direct ancestral line runs through the stone roundhouses of the Scottish Highlands and the north of Ireland. These structures, known variously as brocks, roundhouses, or cloakins depending on their specific form and region, appear in the archaeological record as early as the Bronze Age and remained in active use, in modified forms, well into the 18th and even 19th centuries in the most remote areas of the Scottish Islands. They were built of dry-stacked stone in circular plans, often with walls of extraordinary thickness, 3 to 5 feet in the most substantial examples, and with central hearths positioned to radiate heat outward in every direction simultaneously. The Aran Islands off the west coast of Ireland contain examples of this building tradition that survived into living memory. Their circular stone walls performing the same thermal function that Caleb's foundation performed, scaled up to include the entire structure. Caleb's family connection to County Antrim, a region where circular stone building traditions persisted long after they had been supplanted elsewhere by rectangular timber construction, was almost certainly not irrelevant. He would not have described what he was doing as drawing on ancestral architecture. He would have said, if pressed, that he was building what made sense. But sense, in matters of construction, is rarely invented from nothing, is inherited, filtered through experience, and applied. Thousands of miles to the north and west, the Onangan people of the Aleutian Islands had developed the Barabara, a semi-subterranean dwelling with an oval or roughly circular footprint, built partially into the hillside, roofed with sod and driftwood, entered through a hatch in the roof or a low tunnel in the earth. The Barabara was a thermal masterwork of a different order. By placing the living space below grade, the builders severed the structure's exposure to surface wind almost entirely, using the earth itself as a continuous insulating wall on all sides. Interior temperatures in a well-built Barabara in winter, according to accounts from early European explorers who sheltered in them, were maintained at livable levels, 50 degrees Fahrenheit to 60 degrees Fahrenheit, with minimal fuel consumption in a region where fuel was scarce and the alternatives were lethal. The Onangan had understood, through generations of refinement in one of the most unforgiving climates on Earth, the same principles that Caleb applied: mass over membrane, geometry over convention, the Earth as partner rather than adversary. On the Mongolian steppe, the gur, a circular felt structure stretched over a collapsible wooden lattice frame, solved the same thermal problem through different materials but identical geometry. The circular plan minimized surface area relative to volume. The felt walls, layered 2 or 3 deep in winter, provided a thermal membrane that the circular frame held taut against the wind without the corner stress concentrations that would have torn a rectangular structure apart in a steppe gale. A central hearth, vented through a circular opening at the apex of the conical roof, created a convective chimney effect that drew cold air in along the floor, warmed it, and directed it upward and out, while the circular wall reflected the fire's radiant heat back into the interior from every direction simultaneously. The gur has been refined over at least 1,000 years of use in temperatures that routinely reach -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Its circular geometry is not cultural tradition preserved past its usefulness. It is engineering that has survived because it works. Further south, across the African continent, and particularly in the regions of southern and eastern Africa, the Rondevel, a circular mud and thatch structure built on a stone or compacted earth foundation, repeated the same formal logic in a climate defined not by killing cold, but by extreme diurnal temperature swings, hot days, cold nights, and the need for a structure that could absorb daytime heat and release it slowly through the evening. The thermal mass of mud walls, the circular plan, the conical thatched roof, different latitude, different materials, different cultural context, and the same underlying physics arrived at through the same process of long observation and careful adaptation. None of these cultures had exchanged blueprints. None of them had access to the formalisms of thermodynamics, which would not exist as a scientific discipline for another century after Caleb built his cabin. They had arrived at their solutions through the oldest and most reliable method available: building things, living in them through winters and summers and storms, noticing what failed and what held, and passing the knowledge forward in the form of practice rather than theory. This convergence carries a specific lesson that is easy to miss if you focus on the individual builder, on Caleb, or on the Onangan craftsman, or on the Highland stonemason, rather than on the pattern they all traced. The lesson is not that any one culture discovered something the others missed. The lesson is that the physics of thermal mass, circular geometry, and below-grade construction are universal enough that wherever people faced cold seriously and observed carefully, they found their way to the same answers. The right angle was not a cultural preference. It was a convenience, a concession to the ease of working with straight timber that survived in mild climates because the cost of its thermal inefficiency was low enough to be tolerable. In climates where the cost was survival itself, it was quietly set aside. Caleb Morrow set it aside in the upper bench of a frontier valley, without knowing, or perhaps without needing to know, that he was joining a very long line of builders who had made the same choice for the same reasons, in languages and landscapes he would never encounter. The stone held. It always had. Stand in the average American house built after 1950 and try to find the thermal mass. You will not find it. The walls are 2x4 timber studs, or 2x6 in better insulated examples, filled with fiberglass bats or blown cellulose, and sheathed on the exterior with oriented strand board and vinyl siding. The total thermal mass of a standard residential wall section of this type is negligible. The wood framing absorbs almost no heat. The insulation is specifically designed to prevent heat transfer rather than store it. The exterior sheathing has no meaningful mass at all. The wall's entire thermal strategy is resistance, stopping heat from moving through it, rather than storage. It is, in thermal terms, a membrane, not a vessel. The foundation is poured concrete, strong, damp-resistant, and almost entirely disconnected from the thermal properties of the earth it sits in. Concrete has reasonable thermal mass in isolation, but in standard residential construction, it is wrapped in exterior foam insulation specifically to prevent it from conducting ground temperature into the building. The slab or basement floor is likewise isolated. The thermal equilibrium zone of the earth, that steady 48 degrees Fahrenheit to 52 degrees Fahrenheit reservoir that Caleb's stone foundation deliberately engaged, is kept firmly outside the building envelope. It is treated as irrelevant at best and as a source of unwanted cold at worst. The heating system compensates for all of this. A forced air furnace or heat pump cycles on and off throughout the day and night, responding to a thermostat that measures air temperature at a single point in the house and calls for heat whenever that point drops below the set point. The furnace heats the air. The air loses heat through the walls and ceiling and windows and slab. The thermostat calls for more heat. The cycle continues, consuming fuel or electricity in proportion to how quickly the building loses what has just been added, which, in a building with no thermal mass to slow that loss, is quite quickly indeed. The result is a building that is entirely dependent on continuous mechanical input to maintain comfort. Turn off the heating system in a standard American house in January in a northern climate, and the interior temperature will drop to near outdoor levels within 12 to 24 hours, sometimes faster, depending on construction quality. The building holds nothing. It is a thermally transparent structure, warm when the machine runs, cold when it stops, with no capacity to buffer the transition or sustain livable conditions from its own stored heat. Caleb's cabin, by contrast, held 44 degrees Fahrenheit through a night of minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit with no fire burning. Not because it was better insulated in the modern sense. Its log walls were, by current standards, poorly insulated by any measure, but because the thermal mass of its stone foundation and floor had absorbed enough heat during the evening fire to sustain a meaningful interior temperature through 8 hours of extreme cold, without any mechanical assistance, without any fuel consumption, without any human intervention after 9 in the evening. The irony is not subtle. Modern building science understands thermal mass perfectly well. The concept appears in every serious textbook on passive solar design, in the engineering specifications for rammed earth and adobe construction, in the design principles behind the tram wall, a south-facing masonry wall used in passive solar buildings to absorb daytime sun and radiate it into the interior at night. Architects who design net-zero energy homes routinely incorporate concrete or stone thermal mass elements as central features of the building's energy strategy, precisely because they reduce the mechanical heating and cooling load. The physics that Caleb applied in the 1870s are the same physics that the most advanced passive building designers apply today. But that knowledge does not appear in standard residential construction. The houses that most Americans live in are built to a cost structure that optimizes for construction speed and material efficiency at the moment of building, not for operational efficiency across decades of use. Insulation is cheap. Thermal mass is heavy and slow to place and requires skilled labor to work with. Forced air systems are well understood by contractors, and their components are standardized across the industry. The choice of one approach over another is not purely a technical decision. It is an economic one, made in a context where the cost of heating fuel is externalized and the builder's profit is captured at the moment of sale, not across the building's operational lifetime. The consequence is a civilization that has built itself into extraordinary mechanical dependency for one of the most basic requirements of survival in a cold climate. The average American household spends between $800 and $2,000 per year on space heating, depending on climate and fuel type. That figure has been more or less stable in inflation-adjusted terms for decades because the buildings being heated have not substantially improved in their fundamental thermal efficiency. They are better insulated than they were in 1970. They are no better in thermal mass terms than they were in 1870. Caleb Morrow spent the equivalent of perhaps 3 weeks of labor hauling and stacking stone to build a foundation that reduced his winter fuel consumption by an estimated 60 to 70% compared to his rectangular cabin neighbors. The stone cost nothing. It came from the hillside above. The labor was his own. The payoff was measured in cords it would not cut, in mornings spent at temperatures that permitted thought and movement rather than emergency fire tending, in a fuel reserve that lasted the winter with supply to spare. He did not do this because he had access to better technology. He did it because he was paying close attention to a problem that his circumstances made impossible to ignore. The problem has not changed. The circumstances, for most people, have simply become comfortable enough that the ignoring feels affordable. On the last day of February, with the worst of the winter finally releasing its grip on the valley, Edmund Webb walked over to Caleb Morrow's cabin and asked him a direct question. He had been thinking about it for weeks. Since the January storm. Since the morning he had stood inside that circular room with his hand pressed against warm stone, while his own cabin was still working its way back from 29 degrees Fahrenheit. He had thought about it while cutting the additional wood he had not planned to need. He had thought about it while patching the gap in his northeast corner that had opened another 1/4 inch in the hard freeze. He had thought about it every morning when the fire needed stoking before anything else could happen. If you're going to build it again, Webb said, the foundation, the shape, all of it, would you change anything? Caleb considered the question for a moment. He was at the woodpile, not adding to it, but simply taking stock of what remained. 2.5 cords had carried him through. His neighbors, in aggregate, had burned through somewhere between 4 and 7 cords each, depending on their cabin's construction quality and how severe their worst nights had been. The difference represented days of labor in the forest, weeks of splitting and stacking, a cost in time and physical effort that compounded across every winter of frontier life. I'd go deeper, Caleb said finally, another 6 inches on the north side, and I'd extend the berm further out, maybe 4 feet instead of 2, to keep the frost from working in from the outside a grade. Webb nodded slowly. He had not expected a technical answer. He had expected something more reflective, a philosophy, a lesson, the kind of summation that a man offers when he knows he has been proven right. Caleb offered none of that. He was already looking at the north side of his foundation, thinking about next winter. What Webb carried away from that conversation, and what he would describe in various forms to various people over the following decades, according to the oral history of that settlement, was not a technique. It was a disposition, a way of looking at a building not as a finished object, but as an ongoing negotiation with the environment it sat in. Caleb had not built his cabin and then maintained it. He had built his cabin and then continued to study it, to observe where it succeeded and where it fell short, to note what the cold found and what it couldn't reach, to think about what 6 more inches of depth in the north quadrant would have done to the temperature reading at 4 in the morning during the worst week of January. This disposition, call it thermal literacy or material intelligence, or simply the habit of paying attention to how heat moves through built space, is what the frontier demanded and what modern construction has largely made unnecessary. When a heating bill arrives, it is paid. When a house is cold, the thermostat is adjusted. The negotiation between the building and the climate happens invisibly inside a mechanical system designed by engineers and maintained by contractors, and the occupant is insulated from it in every sense of the word. Caleb Morrow was not insulated from it. He lived inside the negotiation directly, felt it in the floor temperature at midnight, measured it with his thermometer, recorded it in his leather notebook, and adjusted his plans for the following winter accordingly. That directness was not a hardship in his experience of it. It was knowledge. Specific, applicable, continuously refined knowledge about the particular piece of ground his cabin sat on, and the particular climate that came down from the ridge each winter, and the particular way his stone and timber and circular geometry responded to both. The round foundation was not the invention of a lone eccentric who happened to build something odd and got lucky with the weather. It was the output of a mind that had taken the problem of winter seriously enough to work through it from the ground up, literally. From the gravel drainage layer at the bottom of the trench to the capstone course at the top of the foundation, every element reflected a decision about how heat moved and how that movement could be shaped by the materials and geometry of the structure containing it. The lessons embedded in that foundation are not historical curiosities. They are applicable today in any cold climate, at any scale from a small off-grid cabin to a full residential structure, by anyone willing to think carefully about the relationship between mass, geometry, depth, and heat. Thermal mass is not expensive if the material is local stone. Circular or rounded building forms are not impractical if the builder is willing to learn techniques that differ from the standard rectangular grammar. Below-grade construction is not exotic. It is the approach that every serious passive building designer reaches for when the goal is minimum mechanical input and maximum thermal stability. The frontier had a way of making these lessons unavoidable. 2.5 chords versus 6 chords. 44 degrees at dawn versus 29. A cabin that woke you ready to work versus a cabin that woke you fighting to survive. Those numbers are not ancient history. They're the same numbers, scaled to modern fuel costs, modern climate conditions, modern materials, that anyone building in a cold climate will eventually face, in one form or another. The question Caleb answered in that valley was not unique to his time or his circumstances. It is the same question the cold always asks of anyone who builds in it. How much do you understand about where heat goes? His answer was in the stone. It is still there, for anyone paying close enough attention to read it.